Okay, so you want to own a brewery, you picture it immediately. Exposed brick, steel tanks gleaming behind glass, a tap room full of regulars who know your name, and a beer with your name on the label sitting on a shelf in a store 3 towns over. You imagine Friday nights, live music, people raising a glass of something you made with your own hands. That's the dream. Here's what actually happens. Let's start with the entry fee, because it's bigger than almost anyone expects. A small nano brewery, the kind that fits in a garage and produces a few hundred barrels a year, can technically get going for somewhere in the range of $50,000 to $150,000. That covers a handful of fermentation tanks, a basic brewhouse, permits, and enough ingredients to get your first batches out the door. But that's not the brewery most people picture. The taproom and distribution brewery, the one with a real production system, a canning line, cold storage, and a public-facing bar, starts at somewhere around $750,000 and climbs past $2 million before you've sold a single pint. Equipment alone, brewhouse, fermenters, bright tanks, glycol chillers, a canning or bottling line, can run $1 million or more for a mid-size operation producing 5,000 barrels a year. Add in real estate, either buying or heavily renovating a leased space to handle drains, ventilation, and electrical load for industrial equipment, and you're looking at another few $100,000 minimum. Then there's licensing. In the United States, you need a federal brewer's notice from the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, plus state and local licenses, which can take anywhere from 4 months to over a year, depending on where you are. 9 months is a fairly typical wait, and you're paying rent, insurance, and loan interest that whole time before you've brewed a drop. And it doesn't stop with the big-ticket brewhouse. There's a long tail of smaller expenses that add up fast. A lab setup for quality control, because inconsistent beer kills a brand faster than almost anything else. A proper cold chain for storage, since warm beer degrades within days. Point-of-sale systems for the taproom. A website and branding package, because in a market this crowded, generic labels don't sell, and a marketing budget just to get your name in front of people who've never heard of you. Founders often underestimate this long tail by 15 to 25% of their original budget, which means a brewery planned at $1 million frequently ends up costing $1.2 to $1.3 million by the time the doors actually open. So, where does the actual money to build one of these come from? Almost nobody self-funds a real production brewery. The typical path is a mix of personal savings covering maybe 15 to 20% of costs, a small business administration loan or conventional bank loan covering another 50 to 60%, and the rest from private investors or family, people who believe in the dream enough to write a check, knowing full well that most restaurants and breweries fail within their first 5 years. Banks generally want to see real collateral and a business plan. Because breweries are considered a risky lending category, that means founders often personally guarantee the loan, putting their house or savings on the line. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it's the first hint of what nobody tells you at the ribbon cutting. You're not just building a business, you're strapping your personal financial life to a piece of stainless steel equipment that depreciates every single day. Some founders try to sidestep this by starting as a contract brewer, renting time and tank space at an existing underutilized brewery instead of building your own from scratch. This can cut your entry cost down to as little as $20,000 to $50,000. Since you're not buying equipment or a building, it's how a lot of successful beer brands actually started, quietly brewing at someone else's facility for years before ever opening their own doors. But it comes at a cost too. You don't control your production schedule, you're at the mercy of another brewer's capacity and priorities, and your margins shrink because you're paying a fee on top of the ingredient cost. It's a smaller bet, but it's still a bet. And it delays the day you actually own the equipment that makes your beer. Now here's the real cost of ownership, the part that surprises even people who did their homework. Let's talk about a mid-sized regional brewery producing around 10,000 barrels a year. A real established operation, not a hobby. Annual ingredient costs, malt, hops, yeast, water treatment, typically run 8 to 12% of revenue. Packaging, meaning cans, bottles, labels, and cardboard, often eats another 15 to 20%. Then you've got labor, which for a brewery with a tap room can be 30% of revenue once you include brewers, servers, and management. Add utilities, and breweries are enormous water and electricity consumers. Some using 7 barrels of water for every 1 barrel of beer produced, plus insurance, which is expensive because you're combining alcohol service liability with industrial equipment risk. By the time you tally it all up, A lot of small and mid-sized breweries operate on net margins of just 5 to 10% in a good year. In a bad year, plenty operate at a loss and simply don't know it yet because the owner hasn't paid themselves a real salary in 3 years. Hops alone deserve a mention because they're one of the most volatile line items in the entire budget. Certain popular hop varieties used in hazy IPAs can swing wildly in price from one harvest to the next, depending on weather in the Pacific Northwest. Where a huge share of the world's aroma hops are grown, a bad growing season can push contract hop prices up by double digits in a single year, and if you didn't lock in a multi-year supply contract in advance, that cost lands directly on your margin with almost no warning. Here's the hidden trap, the one that catches almost everyone. The expenses start way before the revenue does. You sign your lease, you take delivery of $500,000 in stainless steel, and then beer takes time. A basic lager can be ready in 3 to 4 weeks. But many of the beers that build a brand's reputation, a barrel-aged stout, a Belgian-style ale, need months of conditioning before they're sellable. Meanwhile, your loan payments start immediately. Your rent is due on the first of the month regardless of whether you have product to sell. Permitting delays alone push many breweries past their original opening date by 6 months or more, and every month of delay is a month of debt service with zero revenue. Then there's the equipment depreciation. Nobody budgets for correctly. Stainless tanks last decades, but pumps, valves, gaskets, and refrigeration compressors fail constantly, and repair costs for a broken glycol chiller in the middle of summer can run into the tens of thousands of dollars at the worst possible time, when your fermenters are sitting at the wrong temperature and your beer is at risk. And that's just the mechanics of getting the doors open. What happens in year 2, 3, 4, that's where most owners get blindsided completely, and it's exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to walk you through before it happens to your money instead of someone else's. Because the next part isn't about building the brewery. It's about how it actually survives or doesn't once it's running. If you want to see these breakdowns before you make a decision like this yourself, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe, because what comes next is the part that decides whether that stainless steel becomes an asset or an anchor. So how does a brewery actually make money once it's open? There are really two separate businesses hiding inside every brewery, and understanding both is the difference between profit and slow bankruptcy. The first obvious source of revenue is wholesale distribution, selling kegs and cans to bars, restaurants, and retail stores through a distributor. This is the regulated, heavily controlled channel in most U.S. states. Brewers can't sell directly to retailers. They have to go through a licensed distributor thanks to what's called the 3-tier system left over from Prohibition-era law. That distributor typically takes a cut of 25 to 30% of the price the retailer eventually pays. Your margins on wholesale beer after ingredients, packaging, and distributor cuts often land in the 20 to 30% range. Decent, but not the number that keeps the lights on. And once you sign with a distributor in a given state, you're often locked into that relationship for years under state franchise laws that heavily favor the distributor, meaning you can't easily walk away even if the relationship turns sour. The second source, the less obvious and far more profitable one, is the taproom itself. When you sell a pint directly to a customer across your own bar, you're capturing the full retail price with no distributor and no middleman. Margins on taproom pours can run 70 to 80%, because you're essentially selling the same product you sold wholesale for 3 or 4 times the effective price per ounce. This is why almost every successful modern brewery is obsessed with taproom traffic, merchandise, food trucks, and events. A rooftop trivia night or a live band on a Friday isn't a nice extra. It's often the difference between a brewery that survives and one that doesn't. Some breweries generate over half their total revenue from a taproom that represents a tiny fraction of their total production volume. That's the part nobody puts in the brochure. Your beer isn't really the business. Your building and the experience of drinking in it is the business. There's actually a third, quieter revenue stream too: merchandise and membership. Mug clubs, annual membership programs that offer discounted pours and early access to limited releases. And branded apparel might sound like a rounding error, but for well-run tap rooms, these can add another 5 to 10% of total revenue at margins close to 90%. Since a hoodie or a hat costs a fraction of what people are willing to pay for it. It's a small lever, but in a business running on 5 to 10% net margins, a few extra points from merchandise can be the difference between profit and loss. Now let's talk about a real failure, because the industry is full of them, and it's important to see the specific numbers, not just the vibe. Craft brewery closures in the United States have been climbing steadily. In 2023, More breweries closed than opened for the first time in decades, with over 300 permanent closures recorded in a single year against a backdrop of over 9,000 operating breweries nationwide. Take a case like New Belgium's smaller regional competitors, or the well-documented collapse of chains like Southern Star or various regional taproom groups that expanded too fast during the 2010s craft beer boom. Many of them took on debt to open second and third locations right as the market got saturated with new entrants, then found themselves unable to service that debt when growth slowed. One well-known cautionary tale is Uinta Brewing's struggles and eventual sale after years of expansion, or smaller chains like Karl Strauss scaling back locations after aggressive multi-state growth in the 2010s outpaced actual demand. The pattern repeats. A brewery raises money, expands production capacity, assuming growth will continue at the same rate forever, and then gets caught the moment growth slows, sitting on expensive unused tank capacity and loan payments that don't shrink just because sales did. It's also worth noting how this plays out for the small guy, not just the regional chains. The overwhelming majority of brewery closures aren't dramatic headline collapses, they're quiet ones. A small taproom in a mid-sized town opens with excitement, does well for the first 18 months on novelty alone, and then hits a wall once the local drinking public has already tried everything on the menu. Without a flagship beer people specifically drive across town for, foot traffic slowly declines, and the owner spends the next 2 years quietly bleeding savings before closing without ever making headlines. This is the single most common failure pattern in the entire industry, far more common than any dramatic bankruptcy. Now for the success story, because they do exist, and the numbers are genuinely staggering. Sierra Nevada Brewing, founded in 1980 by Ken Grossman, with what was reportedly around $50,000 scraped together from used dairy and soda bottling equipment, is now one of the largest craft breweries in the country, producing over 1 million barrels a year and generating revenue estimated well into the hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Or look at Boston Beer Company, the parent of Samuel Adams, which went from a home brewing recipe in a kitchen to a publicly traded company worth billions of dollars, at times trading at a market capitalization north of $3 billion. What separates these winners from the 300 breweries that closed in a single year isn't luck. It's usually one of three things. They achieved real scale before their competitors did. Locking in distribution relationships and shelf space early, they built a flagship product with genuine, defensible differentiation, not just another hazy IPA in a market with 15,000 other hazy IPAs. Or they diversified revenue early into bottling, canning for other brands as contract manufacturers, and multi-state distribution before the market got crowded. Because that's really the core lesson buried in all these numbers. What determines whether a brewery survives isn't how good the beer tastes, it's scale, location, and how dependent you are on any single revenue stream. A brewery that depends entirely on one distributor relationship is one contract renegotiation away from disaster. A brewery that depends entirely on local taproom traffic is one bad winter, one road construction project blocking the parking lot, or one regional recession away from a catastrophic drop in revenue. The breweries that survive tend to have at least 3 separate legs to stand on: taproom, wholesale distribution, and something else entirely, whether that's contract brewing for another label, merchandise, or a food program that brings in people who aren't even beer drinkers. Location matters more than most founders admit to themselves before signing a lease. A brewery in a walkable, mixed-use neighborhood with existing foot traffic from restaurants and shops will consistently outperform an identical brewery tucked into an industrial park with free parking but zero passersby, no matter how good the beer inside actually is. So where is this industry actually headed? The craft beer boom of the 2010s, when breweries were opening in the US at a rate of nearly 2 new ones per day, has clearly ended total US. Beer volume has been declining slowly for years as younger drinkers shift toward hard seltzers, canned cocktails, and non-alcoholic alternatives. The non-alcoholic beer category alone has grown by double digits annually in recent years, forcing even legacy breweries to launch zero-alcohol lines just to keep shelf space. At the same time, the market has consolidated hard large. Brewing conglomerates have spent the last decade buying up successful craft breweries, and independent breweries increasingly compete not just against each other, but against corporate-owned craft brands with far deeper marketing budgets. The breweries succeeding today tend to lean hard into hyper-local identity, direct-to-consumer taproom experiences, and community events that a national brand simply can't replicate. Because the one thing a giant conglomerate can't buy is the feeling of being the actual neighborhood brewery where everyone knows the person who made your beer. There's also a generational shift happening in how people drink altogether. Overall, alcohol consumption per capita among younger adults has been trending downward for years, with a growing share of people in their 20s and 30s drinking less overall or choosing occasion-based drinking instead of everyday habit. That means the total pool of beer drinkers a new brewery is fighting over is, in aggregate, slowly shrinking. Even as the number of breweries competing for that shrinking pool multiplied for over a decade before finally starting to level off. Any founder walking into this industry today needs to understand they're not entering a growth market anymore. They're entering a mature, oversaturated one, where winning increasingly means taking share from someone else's existing customers rather than capturing new drinkers who didn't exist before. So let's land the plane with two honest scenarios, because that's what actually matters if you're seriously considering this. In the optimistic scenario, you open a well-capitalized brewery with a genuinely differentiated flagship beer in a location with real foot traffic and a growing local reputation for events. Not just beer. You build a tap room that generates 60% of revenue, diversify into a modest wholesale footprint for the other 40%, and within 5 to 7 years, you're running a business generating somewhere around 10 to 15% net margins on maybe $2 to $3 million in annual revenue. A solid, sustainable small business, though rarely a path to sudden wealth. In the realistic scenario, and this is the one that happens to the majority of people who try this, you underestimate build-out costs by 20 to 30%. Permitting takes twice as long as planned. Your first 18 months run at a loss while you build a customer base. And you spend years working 70-hour weeks, paying yourself less than you'd earn managing someone else's restaurant, hoping that the fifth year is the one where the taproom finally fills up on a Tuesday night. And there's a third path too, quieter than either of these, which is simply breaking even for a decade. Never quite failing, never quite thriving, just enough revenue every year to cover the loan and pay yourself a modest wage, while all the equity you originally put in sits frozen in stainless steel that would sell for a fraction of what you paid if you ever needed to walk away. You're not buying a brewery. You're buying a decade-long bet that people will keep choosing to drink your beer over the 15,000 other options sitting on the same shelf, and a whole lot of stainless steel that only turns into money if they do.